Get out. Right now. You and that baby mean nothing to me. Daniel's voice cut through the night as he threw Ava's bag onto the driveway and slammed the door in her face, the sound echoing louder than anything she had ever felt. And for a moment she just stood there, 8 months pregnant, staring at the closed door like it might open again. Like this was some kind of mistake, but it did not, and the porch light clicked off, leaving her in the dark while the neighbors watched from behind curtains. Not one of them stepping outside, not one voice calling her name. And that was when it settled in, not all at once, but slowly, heavy, unavoidable. She had nowhere to go. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, feeling the small shift inside her, a reminder that she was not alone, even if the world was pretending she was. And without saying a word, she turned, picked up the bag he had thrown like it was nothing, and walked to her car, the same old sedan she had once laughed about, saying it would never leave her stranded, and now it was the only place she had left. She opened the door, sat down carefully, breathing slower than she felt, because panic would not help her now. Nothing would, not anymore. And the silence inside that car was different. It was thick, pressing against her chest, forcing her to think, to feel, to understand something she was not ready to accept. This was real, and still she did not cry, not yet, because something in her refused to break in front of a world that had already decided she was nothing. Hours passed. The temperature dropped, her breath fogged the glass, and she curled slightly, protecting her stomach, whispering something too soft to hear, not words for anyone else, just a quiet promise, maybe to herself, maybe to the child, that this was not the end, even if it felt like it. And somewhere in the distance a car passed, its headlights briefly lighting up her face, revealing how calm she looked, too calm for someone who had just lost everything. But that calm was not peace, it was something else, something building, something waiting, and when morning came, it did not bring relief, it brought eyes, judgment, footsteps approaching her car, a security guard knocking on her window, not gently, not kindly, just firm, impatient. You can't stay here, he said, not even looking at her face, just the situation, just the inconvenience she had become, and she nodded, slowly, because arguing would change nothing, and as she started the engine, the low fuel light flickered on, quiet, but undeniable. Another problem, another limit, another reminder that time was not on her side. And still she said nothing, drove out of the lot, merging into traffic that did not notice her, did not care, and somewhere in that movement, in that quiet desperation, something shifted again, not outside, but inside her, because this was not just about survival anymore. This was about what came next, and she did not know it yet. But someone else was already beginning to notice, and not for the reasons anyone would expect. By the time the sun climbed higher, Ava had already been asked to leave 2 more parking lots, each interaction colder than the last. Each looked sharper, like people had already decided who she was without asking a single question. And the worst part was not the words, it was the way they avoided her eyes, like she did not deserve to be seen, like she had already fallen too far to matter. And when she finally stopped at a small gas station on the edge of town, the kind of place people only used when they had no other option, she sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, watching others move around her like she was invisible, until she forced herself to step out, moving slower now, more careful, because every step carried weight, not just her own. And inside the store the air felt different, colder somehow. The clerk glanced at her once, then again, longer this time, his eyes dropping to her stomach before quickly looking away, and Ava felt it, that quiet judgment, that silent assumption that she had done something wrong just by existing like this. And still she said nothing, just reached for the cheapest water bottle, counting the few bills in her hand twice before placing them on the counter. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something, not obvious, not loud, just a flicker on a small television mounted in the corner, a paused video, grainy, but familiar, and for a second she froze, because the woman in that frame, sitting in a car, looking tired, distant, that was her. And before she could process it, the video started playing again, showing her from earlier that morning, the angle slightly tilted. Someone had recorded it from a distance, and the caption underneath made her chest tighten. Pregnant woman living in her car, what went wrong? And the comments began to scroll, fast, careless, strangers laughing, judging, guessing, and Ava stood there, watching herself become a story. For people who would never know her name, never care about the truth, and something inside her shifted again, not pain this time. Something sharper, something colder, because this was not just bad luck anymore. This was exposure, controlled, timed, and as she stepped back outside, the noise of the world felt louder, heavier, like everything was closing in just a little too perfectly. Her car door creaked as she opened it, and when she sat down, she noticed the envelope on the passenger seat. One she was sure had not been there before, plain, unmarked, and for a moment she did not touch it, just stared, her heart beat slower than it should have been, because something about it did not feel random, not at all, and when she finally picked it up, her fingers hesitated at the edge, like she already knew that whatever was inside was not meant to help her, but to tell her something she was not supposed to understand yet. And as she slowly opened it, a single sheet of paper slid out, with only a few words printed in bold. You were never supposed to disappear, and beneath it, a name she had not heard in a long time. One that made everything around her go completely still, because suddenly this was not just about being abandoned anymore. It was about something much bigger, something planned, and someone out there already knew exactly where she was. The paper trembled slightly in Ava's hand, not because of the cold, but because something inside her refused to stay quiet anymore. And for the first time since that night, she did not sit still. She did not stay silent. She reached for her phone and dialed the number printed beneath the message, her fingers moving faster than her thoughts, because waiting felt worse than whatever truth was coming. And as the call rang, her heart beat. Louder, heavier, until finally a voice answered. Calm, controlled, unfamiliar. You were not supposed to call. The man said, not angry, not surprised, just certain, and that was enough to make Ava pause, but not stop. Who are you? And why do you know my name? She asked, her voice steady even if everything else was not. And there was a silence on the other end, not empty, but measured, like someone deciding how much she was allowed to know. And then the voice returned, lower this time. You should not be where you are, Ava. And the line went dead, just like that. No explanation, no warning, just a statement that did not feel like advice, but like a boundary she had already crossed. And for a moment she stared at the phone, her reflection faint in the dark screen, realizing something she had tried not to think about. This was not random, not the video, not the envelope, not even the way people had started to look at her. It was all too precise, too connected, and instead of fear, something sharper took its place, a need to understand, to push back, even if she was not ready. And before she could stop herself, she made another decision, one she had no time to measure. She turned the key, started the engine, and drove, not away, but toward the address printed faintly at the bottom of the page, barely visible unless you looked closely. And the closer she got, the quieter the roads became, the buildings changing, larger, cleaner, more controlled, until she reached a gated entrance she had never seen before, guarded, silent, watching, and she should have turned around. She knew that, but instead she stepped out of the car, ignoring the tightness in her chest, ignoring the warning in her mind, and walked toward the gate, her presence alone enough to trigger attention, because within seconds a camera shifted, then another, focusing on her, tracking her, and a voice came through a speaker above, state your name. And Ava hesitated, just for a second, because something about the way it was asked made it feel like more than a question, like an entry point she could not undo. But she said it anyway, Ava Carter. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, charged, until the gate clicked, unlocking with a sound that felt too easy, too fast, like she had just confirmed something for them, not for herself. And as she took one step forward, the realization hit her, sharp and immediate. She had just walked into something she did not understand, something that had been waiting for her. And behind her, unnoticed until now, a black car slowly pulled up, engine running, watching her like she had just made a mistake she could not take back. The gate did not creak. It did not hesitate. It opened smoothly, like it had already decided she belonged there. And that was what unsettled Ava the most, not the silence, not the cameras, but the feeling that her arrival had not surprised anyone, that it had been expected. And as she stepped inside, the air itself felt different, controlled, measured, Like every movement in this place followed rules she did not understand. And behind her the soft hum of an engine reminded her she was not alone. She turned slightly, just enough to see the black car still there, still watching, and before she could process it further, the front doors of the building ahead opened without a sound, revealing a man standing just inside, tall, still, his presence quiet but unmistakably heavy, not because he moved, but because everything around him seemed to respond to him, and Ava felt it immediately, that invisible pressure, that difference, the kind you do not need to be told about. You just know, and he did not step forward, did not greet her. He simply looked at her, not scanning, not judging, just seeing. And for the first time since all of this began, Ava felt something she had not allowed herself to feel, not fear exactly, but awareness, a sharp understanding that she had walked into a place where she had no control at all. And still, she did not step back. She moved forward, one slow step at a time, because stopping now would not undo anything. And when she reached the entrance, the man finally spoke, his voice low, steady. You came here on your own. Not a question, just a fact. And Ava nodded slightly, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach, grounding herself, reminding herself why she could not afford to hesitate. I need to know what is happening, she said, her voice quieter than she expected, but it did not shake. And for a moment there was no response, just that same silence, controlled, deliberate, until he shifted slightly, just enough to signal something to someone she could not see. And suddenly 2 other men appeared behind him, not aggressive, not loud, but present, and that was enough, because Ava understood immediately. This was not a conversation she could control, this was a process she had already stepped into. And the man's eyes returned to hers, calm, unreadable. What you need does not matter right now, he said, not harsh, but absolute. And that sentence landed heavier than anything Daniel had said, because it did not try to hurt her. It simply erased her position entirely, and Ava felt it. That loss, not emotional, but structural, like the ground beneath her had shifted into something she could not stand on, and still she tried. Someone is watching me. They sent me here, she said, pushing the words out before she could stop herself, and for the first time, something changed, not in his expression, but in the air, a pause, small, but real, and then he stepped aside, just slightly, creating space for her to enter, but it did not feel like permission. It felt like a test she had already failed, and as she crossed the threshold, the doors closed behind her with a soft finality, cutting off the outside world completely, and in that moment Ava realized something she could not ignore anymore. Whatever this place was, whoever these people were, they were not reacting to her situation, they were managing it, and she was not here to ask questions. She was here because they had already decided she would be, and as she stood there, surrounded by a system she did not understand, with eyes on her from every direction she could not see, the truth settled in, heavy and unavoidable. She was not stepping into power, she was stepping into something that had power over her, and she had no idea how deep it went. The doors sealed behind her with a quiet click, and in that sound, Ava felt something inside her close as well, not fear, not panic, but the last piece of hesitation she had been holding on to, because standing there, surrounded by people who spoke in controlled tones and moved with purpose, she could not interrupt. She realized something she had not wanted to admit before. No one here was going to explain anything to her unless it served them. No one here saw her as someone to protect, only someone to manage. And for a moment, that truth pressed down on her harder than the cold nights in her car, harder than the voices online, harder even than the door Daniel had slammed in her face. Because this was not personal, this was structural, and she was at the bottom of it. And still, she did not move. She stood there, breathing slower, deeper, her hand resting against her stomach again, grounding herself, reminding herself that she could not afford to disappear inside this moment. Not now, not anymore. And when the man in front of her turned slightly, as if the conversation was already over, as if she had already been processed and placed somewhere in their system, something inside her shifted sharply, because for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she felt something stronger than confusion, stronger than exhaustion. She felt resistance, small, fragile, but real. And before she could talk herself out of it, before she could measure the consequences, she spoke again, her voice cutting through the controlled silence. No. And it was quiet. But it stopped the movement around her. Just enough, just for a second, and the man turned back, not surprised, but attentive now, and Ava felt her pulse rise, not from fear, but from the realization that she had just stepped outside the role they had already assigned to her, and she did not stop. "You do not get to decide what matters to me," she said, each word clearer than the last, even as her body reminded her how vulnerable she still was, how tired, how alone, but something in her refused to shrink again. Not here, not like this. And for a moment nothing happened, no immediate reaction, no interruption, just that same silence. But it felt different now, heavier, watching, measuring, and Ava held her ground, even as doubt tried to creep back in, even as a small part of her questioned whether this was a mistake she could not afford. But then she saw it, just a flicker, a shift in the man's expression, not emotion, but recognition, like he had just recalculated something about her. And that was enough. Not victory, not even safety, but confirmation. That she was not invisible here, not entirely, and the realization hit her all at once. This system, whatever it was, thrived on control, on silence, on people accepting their place without question, and the moment she spoke, even this small, even this uncertain, she had disrupted that expectation, and it scared her, because she knew she was not ready. She did not have the information, the support, the power to back it up, but staying quiet had not protected her either. It had only made her easier to ignore, easier to erase. And as she stood there, feeling the weight of everything pressing in from all sides, she made a choice. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. Because for the first time she understood that waiting, hoping, surviving quietly was no longer enough. Not if someone out there was already controlling the narrative of her life. And she straightened slightly, her voice steady again, even as her heart raced. "If I am already inside this, then I am not leaving without answers," she said, not asking, not pleading, but stating it as something she had decided. And in that moment, even without knowing what would come next, Ava crossed a line she could not step back from. Because she was no longer just trying to survive what was happening to her. She was choosing to face it, no matter how far above her it reached. The silence did not break after her words. It shifted, and Ava felt it immediately, like the air itself had adjusted to her presence in a different way, no longer dismissing her, not fully accepting her either, but watching, measuring. And that was enough for her to understand the first rule. This place responded to signals, not emotions, and if she wanted answers, she would have to learn how to send the right ones. So she stopped speaking, stopped pushing, and instead she observed, really, observed, the way the men behind the first man positioned themselves, not randomly, always slightly behind, slightly to the side, never blocking, always framing, the way no one interrupted him, not even with a glance, the way information seemed to flow in quiet gestures instead of words, and Ava realized something important. Power here was not loud. It was structured, layered, and invisible unless you knew where to look. And for the first time since she stepped inside, she let go of the need to be heard and replaced it with something else, something colder, more precise. She needed to understand the pattern, because if she could see it, she could test it. And so she waited, letting the moment stretch just long enough to feel intentional. Then she shifted slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just enough to change her position in the space, and she spoke again. But this time differently, slower, more controlled. "If I was not supposed to disappear, then someone here already knows why," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just placing a statement into the system like a piece on a board. And the reaction came, not from the man in front of her, but from one of the men behind him, just a fraction of a second, a glance, a subtle tightening of posture, and Ava caught it, because she was looking for it now. And in that tiny shift she saw confirmation, not of the answer, but of the direction, and that was enough to push further, but not recklessly, not like before. This time she adjusted again, her tone softer, almost neutral. "I am not asking for everything," she continued, "just enough to understand why I was brought here instead of being left out there." And she let the sentence hang, not filling the silence, not rushing to defend it, because she had already learned that silence here was not emptiness, it was pressure. And if she held it correctly, It could reveal something. And for a moment nothing changed, but then the man in front of her moved, just slightly, not stepping forward, but shifting his weight, and Ava noticed something she had missed before, a small earpiece, almost invisible, and suddenly it made sense, the pauses, the timing, the way decisions did not seem to come from a single person. This was not just a place, it was a network, layered, connected, and she was standing at the edge of it. And instead of shrinking from that realization, something inside her sharpened again, because now she knew what she was dealing with, not chaos, not randomness, but a system, and systems had patterns, and patterns could be tested. So she made one more move, small, deliberate. She took a step back, not retreating, but creating space, changing the dynamic just enough to force a response. And it worked, because immediately one of the men behind shifted position to close that space, subtle, automatic, and Ava saw it clearly now. Boundaries, invisible but enforced, and that meant something else. If there were boundaries, there were limits, and if there were limits, they could be pushed, slowly, carefully. And for the first time since everything began, Ava felt something different settle in her chest. Not relief, not safety, but control, just a fraction of it. But real, because she was no longer reacting blindly. She was learning, adapting, and testing. And as the man in front of her finally spoke again, his voice unchanged, steady. "You are asking the wrong questions." Ava did not feel shut down. She felt guided, because now she understood. This was not about being given answers. It was about earning access to them. And without hesitation, she adjusted again, her voice even quieter, more precise. "Then tell me what I should be asking." And this time, the pause that followed was different, longer, heavier, and somewhere beyond the visible room. Something shifted in response to her, because for the first time, she was not just inside the system, she was interacting with it. And then, unexpectedly, one of the men behind stepped forward just enough to hand something to the man in front, a small folder, thin, controlled, and Ava's eyes locked onto it instantly, because she knew without being told, whatever was inside that folder was not meant to be given to her, not yet. And yet it had been brought out the moment she changed her approach. And in that single detail, Ava saw the result of her first real move, small, quiet, but undeniable. She had just made something happen. The folder did not move right away, and that hesitation was enough for Ava to feel it, the shift in attention, subtle but undeniable, because this time it was not just the system reacting, it was him, the man in front of her no longer simply processing her presence, but studying it, and Ava felt that difference immediately, like stepping into a light she did not ask for, one that did not warm, only revealed. And for a brief second her instincts told her to look away, to step back into silence. But she did not, because she had already crossed that line, and retreat now would erase everything she had just gained. So she held her position, her eyes steady, not challenging, not submissive, just present, and that alone was enough to change the space between them. Because people in this place did not hold eye contact unless they had a reason, and she had just created one, and the man noticed, not with expression, but with stillness, the kind that made everything else feel slower, quieter, like the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next, and Ava felt the weight of that moment press against her chest, but instead of breaking it, she leaned into it, just slightly, letting the silence stretch until it became something she could use, and then she spoke, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "You were not going to show me that," she said, her gaze shifting briefly toward the folder, then back to him. And that single acknowledgement landed differently than any question she had asked before, because it was not a request, it was an observation, and for the first time, the man's focus narrowed, not outward, not toward the others, but directly onto her, and Ava felt it, that attention sharpening, not emotional, not personal, but precise, like she had just moved from being part of a situation to becoming part of a calculation, and it would have been easy to misread it, to think it meant she was gaining ground. But Ava understood better now. Attention here was not given lightly, and it was never neutral. It meant she had become something to watch, something to evaluate, and that came with risk, real risk, because the more visible she became, the less room she had to move without consequence. And still, she did not step back, because stepping back would confirm what they already expected, that she would fold under pressure, that she would accept her place. And something in her refused to give them that. Not anymore. And so she made another move, small, deliberate. She shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself, steadying her breath, and let her voice drop just enough to carry intention without force. So the question is not what I should ask, she said slowly. It is what you are not saying. And this time the silence that followed was not empty at all. It was charged, because she had done something different again. She had not asked for information, she had pointed to its absence. And that changed the dynamic completely, because now it was not about whether she deserved answers. It was about whether they could continue to withhold them without acknowledging her awareness. And Ava saw it, not in words, but in the smallest shift of movement behind him. A glance exchanged, a pause that lasted just a fraction too long. And in that moment she understood something critical. She had disrupted the expected pattern again, and that disruption had consequences, not immediate, not visible yet, but real. And as the man finally moved, his hand resting lightly on the folder without opening it, Ava felt a strange clarity settle in, because she realized she was no longer just reacting to this system. She was influencing it, even if only in small ways, even if only for now. And that realization changed something inside her, because it meant she was not powerless, not completely, but it also meant something else, something more dangerous. Because if she could influence the system, then the system would begin to respond to her differently, more carefully, more directly. And that meant she would be watched more closely than before. And as the man's eyes held hers for just a second longer than necessary, Ava felt that truth settle deep, not as fear, but as awareness, because this was no longer just about surviving inside a structure she did not understand. It was about being seen by it, evaluated by it, and possibly reshaped by it. And as the moment stretched, quiet but heavy, Ava realized something she could not ignore. She was no longer invisible. And in this place, that might be the most dangerous position of all, because people like her were not supposed to notice patterns, not supposed to speak in observations, not supposed to remain steady under pressure, and yet she had done all three. And somewhere within this system, someone was already asking the question she could feel forming in the silence. Who exactly is she supposed to be? The room did not move, but something inside it shifted again, slower this time, heavier, like a layer beneath the surface had just been touched, and Ava felt it before she understood it. That quiet tension that came when something hidden was about to show itself, not fully, not clearly, but enough to change everything. And the man in front of her finally opened the folder, not in a dramatic way, not to reveal it to her, but just enough to glance inside, as if confirming something that had already been decided long before she walked through that gate. And when he looked back at her, there was no surprise in his eyes, only a kind of certainty that made her chest tighten. You were not supposed to reach this point, he said, calm, controlled. And that sentence landed differently than anything else, because it was not about what she did. It was about where she was, like her entire path had been mapped out, measured, expected to stop somewhere far behind her. And Ava felt something inside her crack slightly, not weakness, but clarity, because for the first time, she understood that what had happened to her was not just a series of bad moments, not just betrayal, not just abandonment. It was part of something structured, something intentional. And before she could stop herself, the words came out, quieter, sharper. Daniel was not the beginning, was he? And the silence that followed was not denial. It was confirmation. And Ava felt it immediately, like a missing piece sliding into place, because suddenly everything made more sense. The timing, the way she had been pushed out so cleanly, the way no one had stepped in, the way her situation had been exposed so quickly. It was not just that she had been abandoned, it was that her fall had been allowed, maybe even arranged, and the realization hit her deeper than anything before, not because it hurt, but because it stripped away the last illusion she had been holding on to. That this was personal, that it was just about one man making one decision. But it was not. She had been part of a larger movement, a smaller piece inside something much bigger, and that thought should have broken her. It should have pushed her back into silence, but instead it did the opposite, because with that clarity came something else. Anger, not loud, not explosive, but focused, steady, and dangerous, and Ava felt it settle into her chest like a new kind of strength, because if she had been used, then someone had made that choice. Someone had decided she was expendable, and that meant there was a structure behind it, a system that had rules, and rules could be challenged. And for a moment she looked at the man in front of her differently, not as an answer, but as a doorway, a point of connection to something deeper, and her voice changed again, not softer, not louder, but sharper, more intentional. "So I was never meant to survive this part," she said, not asking, just stating it. And the man did not correct her, did not deny it. And that was enough. Because in that silence, Ava found confirmation of something much larger than Daniel. Much larger than the night she was thrown out. Something that reached further back than she had realized. And as that truth settled in, her hand pressed more firmly against her stomach, grounding her, reminding her that this was not just about understanding anymore. It was about what came next, because now she knew. She had not just been pushed out, she had been positioned, and that meant someone out there was still expecting something from her, something she had not fulfilled yet, and that thought lingered, sharp and unresolved, because if her fall had been part of a plan, then her survival was not an accident either. And somewhere beyond this room, beyond this controlled silence and measured responses, there was a layer she had not even touched yet, something bigger, something still hidden, and for the first time, Ava understood that what she was seeing now was only the surface of something far more dangerous than she had imagined. The realization did not paralyze Ava, it sharpened her, because once the illusion was gone, once she accepted that she had been placed, used, and monitored, the fear lost its power and turned into something far more useful, focus. And for the first time she stopped trying to understand everything at once and instead chose something smaller, something specific, something she could actually control. And her eyes returned to the folder in the man's hand, not as an object of curiosity, but as a signal, because it had appeared the moment she changed her approach, which meant it was tied to her behavior, not just her identity. And that was the first real advantage she had found, small, fragile, but real, and instead of asking for it, she shifted her stance again, subtly lowering her gaze just enough to break direct tension, not in submission, but in calculation, creating a moment where attention would naturally drift. And it worked, not completely, not dramatically, but enough, because the man's focus shifted for just a second toward the others behind him, as if receiving confirmation or instruction. And in that fraction of time, Ava spoke again, her tone softer, controlled, almost reflective. "If I was meant to stop before this, then someone miscalculated," she said, not as a challenge, but as a statement placed carefully into the system, and the effect was immediate, not loud, but precise, because this time the reaction did not come from movement, it came from stillness, a pause that lasted just a fraction too long. And Ava recognized it for what it was, hesitation, and that told her everything she needed to know. There were limits here, even within this controlled environment, even within this structure, and she had just touched one of them, and that realization gave her something new, something she had not felt since before everything collapsed. Leverage, not enough to win, not enough to escape, but enough to shift the balance, even if only slightly, and she did not waste it, she adjusted again, stepping just half an inch closer, not enough to trigger resistance, but enough to reclaim space. And this time her voice carried a different kind of weight, quieter, but anchored. "So now you have a problem," she continued, her eyes steady again. "Because I am still here." And the silence that followed was not passive, it was active, processing, recalibrating, and Ava felt it, that shift in the system around her, because she was no longer just a variable, she was an anomaly. Something that did not behave the way it was expected to, and anomalies required attention, required adjustment, and that was her opening. And for a brief moment, the man's hand tightened slightly on the folder, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Ava saw it, and that was when she understood the full weight of what she had done. She had forced a reaction, a real one, not scripted, not controlled, and that meant something had moved, even if only internally, and for the first time, the distance between them felt different, not smaller, not equal, but altered, because now he was not just observing her, he was accounting for her, and that changed everything, even if it was still dangerous, even if it could disappear the moment she misstepped, and Ava knew that. She felt it in the tension that still surrounded her, in the quiet presence of the others who had not moved, in the way the room still belonged entirely to them. But she also felt something else, something that had not been there before, a shift in position, however slight, because she had just proven that she could influence what happened next, and that was enough to change how she moved, how she thought, how she chose her next step. And as the man finally spoke again, slower this time, more deliberate, "You are assuming too much." Ava did not hear a warning. She heard confirmation, because assumptions only mattered when they came close to something real, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to hold that advantage, to feel it, to understand it, before she adjusted again, because she knew it would not last if she pushed too far, too fast. And just as she steadied herself, preparing her next move, something changed behind. The man, subtle but unmistakable. One of the others stepped forward slightly, his posture tighter, more alert, and Ava felt it immediately, the shift from observation to concern, because her presence was no longer just unusual, it was becoming disruptive, and somewhere within this system, someone had just noticed that change. The shift came faster than Ava expected, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, immediate, and impossible to ignore, because the moment that man stepped forward behind him, the entire atmosphere tightened, like an invisible line had been crossed, and Ava felt it press against her chest before she even understood what it meant. And then it happened. The man in front of her closed the folder, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with finality, as if something had just been decided, not about the system, but about her. And without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he spoke. "You are no longer here to ask questions." And those words hit differently, sharper, colder, because they were not a correction, they were a restriction, a boundary being enforced in real time. And Ava felt it instantly, the loss of the small space she had just created, the fragile advantage slipping through her fingers before she could hold on to it. And her instinct told her to respond, to push back, to reclaim that ground, but something deeper, something she had only just begun to understand, told her to pause, because this was not a moment to act blindly. This was a moment where every move would cost something, and she felt that cost before it was even shown to her. And then the real consequence arrived, not through words, but through absence, because when she turned her head slightly, just enough to check, the door behind her was no longer just closed, it was sealed, completely, the faint outline of it blending into the wall, as if it had never been there at all. And that was when it hit her, sharp and immediate. She was not being guided anymore. She was being contained, and the realization sent a wave through her body, not panic, but pressure, the kind that builds when there is nowhere left to step back to. And still she tried to hold on to something, anything, her voice quieter now, but still controlled. "You brought me here," she said, not accusing, not pleading, just stating what she believed was still true. And for a moment there was silence, but it was not the same silence as before. This one felt heavier, final, and then the man replied, just as calm, just as steady. "No, you came here." And that distinction landed harder than anything else, because it stripped away the last piece of control she thought she had, the idea that she had chosen this, that she had moved into it on her own terms, and suddenly everything shifted. Because if she had not been brought here, then she had been led here, step by step, choice by choice, until there was no difference between her decisions and their design. And Ava felt it all at once, the weight of that realization crashing into everything she had been holding together, because it meant she had not just been reacting, she had been participating in something she did not even see. And for the first time since she walked through that gate, her composure cracked, not outwardly, not enough for them to see weakness, but inside, something gave, something that had been holding her steady through everything. And her breath caught, just slightly, as her hand pressed harder against her stomach, grounding herself, fighting the rising pressure that threatened to take over. And in that moment, she understood something she had not been ready to face before. This was bigger than her, bigger than Daniel, bigger than any single choice she had made, and she was already too deep inside it to step out. And the room did not react to her struggle. It did not acknowledge it, because to them, this was expected. This was the point where people either adjusted or broke, and Ava felt herself standing right at that edge, the line between holding on and losing everything. And as the silence closed in around her again, heavier than before, more suffocating, She realized just how little control she truly had left, because no matter what she did next, the system had already moved ahead of her, and for the first time, she could not see a way forward, only the overwhelming weight of something she could no longer outrun. The silence did not just surround Ava, it settled inside her, heavy and unmoving, like something had finally reached the point where it could not be pushed any further, and for the first time since she stepped into this place, she did not speak. She did not calculate her next move. She did not search for patterns or reactions. She simply stood there, breathing slowly, as if even that required effort now, and the weight of everything pressed down at once, not in sharp waves, but in a steady, crushing presence that left no space to escape, because every piece of it was still there. Daniel's voice, the door closing, the cold night in her car, the eyes watching her, the video spreading, the envelope, the message, the call that ended too quickly, the gate that opened too easily, and now this quiet, controlled room where every choice she thought she made had already been accounted for, and as all of it settled into place, something inside her finally gave way, not loudly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, deeply, like a thread that had been stretched too far for too long, and her gaze dropped, just slightly, not in surrender, but in exhaustion, because for the first time she could not hold all of it together at once. And the thought came, quiet but undeniable. What if there was no way out of this? What if every step forward only pulled her deeper into something she did not understand? Something she could not fight, and for a moment that thought stayed there, longer than it should have, heavier than anything before, and Ava felt the edge of it. That dangerous place where people stopped trying, where they accepted whatever came next because resistance felt meaningless, and her fingers tightened slightly against her stomach, not out of fear, but instinct, grounding herself in something real, something that still belonged to her. And that was when the silence shifted again, not outside, but within her, because beneath the exhaustion, beneath the weight of everything she had just realized, something else was still there, quieter now, but not gone, and it was not hope. Not in the way people usually felt it. It was something harder, something that did not disappear just because things became impossible, and Ava held on to that feeling, not because it made sense, but because it was the only thing that had not been taken from her yet, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her breathing steadied, her posture adjusted, just enough to remind herself that she was still here, still present, still part of what was happening, even if she did not control it. And the realization came again, clearer this time. She had been led here, placed here, expected to stop, expected to break, and maybe she had come close, maybe closer than she wanted to admit, but she had not completely, and that mattered, even if no one else saw it, even if the system around her had already moved on, because inside that small, quiet space, Ava understood something that changed everything again, not in the world around her, but within herself. She did not need to understand everything yet. She did not need to win. She only needed to not disappear, not fold, not become what they expected her to be. And that thought settled into something solid, something she could hold on to. And without lifting her head fully, without drawing attention back to herself, Ava made a decision, not spoken, not visible, but clear. She would not fight this all at once. She would not push blindly again. She would wait, watch, learn, and choose her next move with precision, because if they had planned her fall, then she would plan her way back, step by step, no matter how long it took. The silence did not feel as heavy anymore, not because the pressure had disappeared, but because Ava no longer resisted it the same way. She absorbed it, studied it, let it exist without letting it break her. And that was the first real change, subtle but undeniable, because where she once reacted, now she paused. Where she once questioned, now she observed, and the difference was not visible to anyone else in the room. But it was real. It lived in the way her shoulders no longer tightened under their gaze, in the way her breathing stayed, even when the weight of the moment pressed in. And most of all, it lived in the way her thoughts moved, no longer scattered, no longer chasing answers, but organizing themselves into something sharper, more deliberate. And Ava realized something that changed everything again. This system did not reward emotion. It did not respond to pain. It only responded to structure, to patterns, to control. and if she wanted to move inside it, she had to become something it could not easily predict, something it could not easily categorize, and that meant letting go of the version of herself that had walked into this place in the first place. The version that still believed she could ask for fairness, that someone would explain things if she just pushed hard enough, that there was a moment where truth would be given instead of taken. And as that realization settled in, Ava felt something inside her quiet down completely. Not hope, not fear, but expectation, because she no longer expected anything from them, and that alone gave her something they could not control. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she lifted her gaze again, not to challenge, not to demand, but simply to see, really see, the man in front of her, the men behind him, the space between them, the way information moved without words, the way silence was used as a tool, and for the first time, she did not feel overwhelmed by it. She mapped it, piece by piece, recognizing where attention shifted, where decisions paused, where control tightened, and that awareness settled into her like a new instinct, something she could rely on, something she could build from. And when she spoke again, it was different, completely different, not emotional, not reactive, but measured, precise. "Then I will wait," she said, her voice calm, almost neutral, and that simple sentence carried more weight than anything she had said before, because it was not resistance, it was alignment, not with them, but with the structure itself. And Ava saw it immediately, the subtle change in how they received her, not as a problem to contain, not as an anomaly to correct, but as something that might fit, something that might be processed differently. And that was her first real shift in position, not visible, not secure, but real, and she did not push it further. She did not test it again, because now she understood the cost of moving too fast, and instead she stepped back internally, letting the moment settle, letting them adjust to this new version of her, because that was the second change. She was no longer trying to force the system to respond. She was allowing it to reveal itself. And in that quiet recalibration, Ava felt something else take shape, something stronger than before, not just control, but direction. Because now she was not just surviving inside this structure. She was preparing to move through it. And as her hand rested lightly against her stomach again, grounding her in something real, something untouched by all of this, she understood the final piece of what she needed to become, not louder, not stronger in the obvious ways, but sharper, colder, more precise than anyone expected her to be. And as the silence settled once more, no longer suffocating, but controlled, Ava stood there not as the woman who had been thrown out into the night, not as the woman who had slept in her car, but as someone who had already begun to change in ways no one here had fully recognized yet, because the version of her they thought they understood was already gone. Nothing in the room changed on the surface, and that was exactly what Ava expected now, because she had learned that the most important shifts here never announced themselves. They revealed themselves in reactions, in timing, in what was withheld rather than what was said. And so she did not rush. She did not try to take advantage of the moment too quickly. She let the silence stretch just long enough to feel natural, just long enough for them to adjust to this new version of her. And then she made her move, not forward, not aggressive, but precise. She shifted her attention back to the folder again, not staring, not demanding, just acknowledging its presence like it was part of the conversation now. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same controlled calm. "You said I was not supposed to reach this point," she began, her tone even, "which means this file was not meant to be opened yet." And she paused, not to wait for permission, but to let the logic settle into the space, to let them process the fact that she was no longer guessing. She was connecting, and then she continued, softer this time, almost like she was offering them a solution instead of creating a problem. "So if I am already here, then keeping it closed does not protect anything anymore." And that was the shift, subtle but powerful, because she had just reframed the situation, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as a practical adjustment within their own system. And Ava felt it immediately, the tension recalibrating, the weight of the room shifting slightly, because this was no longer about whether she deserved access, it was about whether denying it still made sense, and that was a different kind of pressure entirely. And she held that position without pushing further, without overplaying it, because she knew now that the moment you forced something here, it broke, but if you aligned with it, it moved. And for a few seconds nothing happened, and those seconds stretched just long enough to test her control, but she did not react. She did not fill the silence. She simply waited, and then it happened. Small, almost unnoticeable, but undeniable. The man's hand shifted again on the folder, not closing it tighter, not pulling it away, just adjusting. And Ava saw it. That micro-movement that meant something inside the system had changed. And then he spoke, slower than before, more deliberate. "You are adapting quickly." And that was not praise, it was recognition, and Ava understood the difference. Because recognition meant she had moved from being unpredictable to being evaluated. And evaluation meant she had entered a different layer of their attention, and that was exactly where she needed to be. And she did not respond to his words. She did not acknowledge them. Because this was not about conversation anymore. This was about positioning, and instead she made one final adjustment, just enough to close the distance by a fraction, not physically, but in presence, her voice lower now, steady. "Then you also know I am not going to stop here," she said, not as a threat, but as a certainty, and this time the silence that followed did not resist her, it considered her, and that was the moment everything shifted, because without another word, without any visible signal, the man opened the folder, not fully, not carelessly, but enough for her to see, enough for her to understand, and Ava's eyes moved quickly, taking in what she could in. That brief window, names, dates, transactions, patterns, pieces of something much larger than she had imagined, and one detail stood out immediately, something she recognized, something that connected directly back to her, not as a victim, but as a variable that had been tracked long before she realized it. And in that instant, Ava felt it, not just control, not just leverage, but clarity, because she was no longer guessing her place in this system. She was seeing it, even if only partially, even if only for a moment. And that was more than she had before, more than she expected to gain this quickly. And as the folder closed again, as the room returned to its controlled stillness, Ava did not feel the loss of that moment. She felt the gain, because she had just done something that should not have been possible. She had forced access, not through force, but through alignment, and in doing so, she had shifted her position in a way that even they had not anticipated, and for the first time since everything began, Ava understood something with absolute certainty. She was no longer just inside the system. She was beginning to move within it, and that changed the balance more than anyone in that room was ready to admit. The folder closed, but the impact of what she had seen did not. It stayed with Ava, sharp, precise, like a line had been drawn in her mind that could not be erased. And when she lifted her gaze again, it was different, not searching, not questioning, but measuring. And for the first time since she entered this place, she did not feel like she was trying to catch up. She felt like she was beginning to stand her ground, even if only for a moment. And that was when the shift between them became undeniable, because the man in front of her no longer treated her like a variable that needed to be contained. He treated her like something that required direct attention, and Ava felt it in the way his posture adjusted slightly, not more relaxed, not more tense, just more focused, like the space between them had narrowed into something deliberate. And for a second, neither of them spoke, and that silence felt different now, not controlled by the system, but shared between them, like both were aware that something had changed, something neither of them would acknowledge directly. And Ava held that moment, not rushing it, not breaking it, because she understood now that this was where the real interaction began, not in questions or answers, but in how long each of them could hold the space without giving anything away. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same calm precision she had learned to use. "You already knew I would understand what I saw," she said, not asking, not accusing, just placing the statement between them like a test. And the man did not respond immediately. But Ava noticed the smallest detail. His gaze did not shift away from her. It stayed exactly where it was, steady, unbroken, and that told her everything she needed to know. Because in a place where attention was controlled so carefully, holding it like that meant something. It meant she had moved from being observed to being assessed, and she did not look away either, not out of defiance, but because she had learned that breaking eye contact here was a signal, and she was not ready to give that signal anymore. And the silence stretched again, longer this time, heavier, like both of them were weighing something unseen. And then he spoke, his voice unchanged, but carrying a different kind of weight. Understanding is not the same as knowing what to do with it. And that line landed exactly where it was meant to, not dismissing her, not challenging her directly, but setting a boundary she could not ignore, and Ava felt it. That subtle pressure pushing back against the ground she had just gained. And for a moment, she could have stepped back. She could have accepted that limit, but she did not, because now she understood something else. This was not about proving anything to him. It was about defining her position within this space. And so she adjusted again, not louder, not sharper, just more certain. Then that depends on what you think I am supposed to do, she replied. And that was the shift, because she had just turned the focus back onto him, not as a challenge, but as a reflection, forcing the conversation into a space where his assumptions became visible, and Ava saw it, not in his expression, but in the pause that followed, a fraction longer than before, and that pause told her she had reached something real, something he had not expected her to touch so quickly, and the tension between them tightened, not aggressively, but with clarity, like both of them were now fully aware of the line they were standing on, and neither of them was willing to step away from it. And Ava felt it in her chest, not as fear, but as awareness, because this was no longer about surviving the system. This was about navigating someone who represented it, someone who understood its rules, as deeply as she was beginning to, and for a moment, she allowed herself to see it clearly, the balance, fragile, unstable, but real, because neither of them held complete control in this interaction anymore, not in this moment. And that was enough to keep her steady, enough to keep her from overreaching. And as the silence returned once more, not empty, but filled with unspoken calculation, Ava understood one thing with absolute certainty. This was not an ending, not even close. This was the beginning of something much more complex, much more dangerous, because now both of them were aware of each other, not just as roles within a system, but as players within it, and neither of them had shown everything they were capable of yet. The silence between them did not break. It deepened, and Ava felt it shift into something more deliberate, like the moment before a piece of truth is placed on the table, not to explain everything, but to change how everything is seen. And she did not rush it. She held her position, her eyes steady, her breathing even, because she understood now that whatever came next would not be given freely. It would be placed carefully, with intention. And when the man finally spoke, his voice carried that same calm weight, but there was something different beneath it, something more precise. Daniel was never meant to keep anything, he said, and the words landed quietly. But they cut through everything Ava thought she understood, not because they were loud, but because they rearranged the entire frame of what had happened to her. And for a second, she did not respond, not because she did not understand, but because she understood too quickly, and that made it more dangerous. Because if Daniel was not meant to keep anything, then his actions were not driven by greed alone. They were part of something assigned, something temporary, and Ava felt that realization settle into her chest, colder than before, sharper, because it meant the betrayal she experienced was not just personal, it was functional, and that made it worse, not better, and her mind moved through it fast, connecting what she had seen in the folder, the names, the patterns, the structure. And suddenly Daniel did not look like the center of anything anymore. He looked like a position, a role someone had filled, and that thought shifted something deep inside her, because it meant removing him would not undo what had been done. It would not fix anything. It would not even matter in the way she once believed it would. And Ava felt the anger that had been building inside her change shape, not disappearing, but redirecting, focusing on something larger, something she could not yet fully see. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but far more controlled than before. So he was just a placeholder, she said, not asking, not accusing, just placing the understanding where it belonged. And again, the man did not correct her, did not confirm it outright, but his silence carried weight, the kind that made denial unnecessary. And Ava recognized it immediately, because she had learned to read that kind of response now. And in that moment, something shifted again, deeper than before, because this was not just new information, this was a change in perspective, a realization that everything she had been reacting to, everything she had been trying to make sense of, was only a surface layer of something far more structured, far more intentional. and that realization forced her to adjust again, not outwardly, but internally, because now the question was no longer why did this happen to me? It was who benefits from this happening. And Ava felt that question settle into her thoughts, heavier, more complex, because it opened a direction she had not fully considered yet. And as she looked at the man in front of her, she saw him differently now, not as someone holding answers, but as someone positioned within that same structure, someone who might not even be at the top of it. And that thought lingered, quiet but persistent, because if he was not the highest point, then there was something above him, something she had not even touched yet. And for a moment, the space between them felt different again, not smaller, not larger, but layered, like there were now multiple levels of understanding sitting between them, and Ava held that awareness carefully, because she knew better now than to reach for all of it at once, and instead she made a small adjustment, her voice steady, almost neutral. Then someone else decided I had to fall, she said, not pushing, not demanding, just stating what now felt unavoidable. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, because this time, it was not just about her position, it was about the structure behind it, and Ava felt it, that subtle resistance, that careful boundary forming again, not denying her, but not allowing her to move further just yet. And that was enough to confirm what she needed to know, because she was no longer dealing with a single layer of control, she was dealing with something that extended beyond what she could see, beyond what had been revealed so far. And as that realization settled in, Ava understood something that changed the direction of her thinking completely. This was never about removing one person or reclaiming one thing. It was about understanding a system that had already accounted for her before she even knew she was part of it. And somewhere within that system, there was a point of origin, a decision that had set everything in motion, and she had not reached it yet, not even close. Because the truth she had just uncovered was not an answer. It was only the first layer of something much deeper and far more dangerous than she had imagined. The realization did not settle into comfort. It sharpened into calculation, and Ava felt it immediately, because once she understood that Daniel had only been a role, not the source, the question was no longer who betrayed her, but who allowed it, who needed it, and more importantly, who could reverse it. And her eyes returned to the man in front of her with a different kind of focus now, not searching for answers, but measuring value. Because if he stood within this structure, then he was either a gate or a barrier, and either way, he could be used, and Ava did not rush into it. She let the silence breathe just long enough to make her next words feel intentional, not reactive. You did not stop it, she said calmly, her voice steady, not accusing, just placing the fact between them. And that statement carried weight, because it acknowledged his position without challenging it directly. And for a moment, nothing changed, but Ava saw it, that slight narrowing of his gaze, not defensive, but attentive, and that was enough, because attention meant engagement, and engagement meant opportunity, and she moved carefully, adjusting her tone just enough to shift the direction of the conversation. Which means you are not here to fix what happened, she continued. You are here to manage what happens next. And that was the pivot, subtle but precise, because she had just redefined his role out loud, not as an obstacle, but as a function, and Ava felt the tension in the room recalibrate again, not resisting her, but aligning with the logic she had just introduced. And she did not stop there, because she knew momentum here was fragile. It had to be maintained without forcing it. So the real question is not what you are hiding from me, she added quietly. It is what you need from me now. And that was the shift that mattered, because she had just moved herself from being a problem to being a variable of interest, and Ava held that position carefully, not pushing further, not softening it, just letting it exist long enough to be recognized. And for the first time, the man's response came without delay, not faster, but more direct. You assume you have something we need, he said, and Ava did not miss the phrasing. Not what you know, not what you want, but what you have, and that told her everything, because it meant this was not about information alone, it was about position, about timing, about something she represented within the system that had not yet been fully resolved, and Ava felt that understanding settle in, steady, controlled, and instead of denying it, instead of proving it, she leaned into it just enough to keep the balance. You already opened the file, she replied, her voice even. So you already know I do. And the silence that followed was not resistance. It was acknowledgement, quiet but real. And Ava recognized it immediately, because this was no longer about convincing him. It was about confirming something he had already begun to consider. And that was when she made her next move, small, deliberate. I do not need everything, she said, lowering her voice slightly. Just access to the parts that connect to me. And that request was different from anything she had asked before, because it was not emotional, not reactive, it was strategic, limited, and aligned with the structure she had learned to read. And Ava felt it again, that subtle shift, not acceptance, not agreement, but consideration. And in this place, that was enough, because consideration meant she had entered the process, not as an outsider, but as a participant, and she held that space without pressing further, because she understood now that pushing too far would break it. And instead she waited, letting the tension settle into something quieter, more controlled, until the man finally responded, slower this time, more deliberate. Temporary access, he said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, because they were not permission, they were terms, and Ava understood that immediately, because nothing here was given without condition, and that meant this was not trust, not even close. It was alignment of interest, temporary, fragile, and entirely reversible, and Ava accepted it without hesitation, not outwardly, but internally, because she knew this was exactly what she needed, not safety, not certainty, but entry. And as the silence returned once more, no longer heavy, but calculated, Ava understood something with absolute clarity. This was not a partnership, it was a transaction, one where both sides were measuring, adjusting, waiting for the moment the balance shifted too far. And as she stood there, steady, composed, no longer the woman who had walked in, Ava felt the truth settle in quietly, because any step forward she took from here would come with a cost. And any mistake she made would not just close the door again, it would lock it permanently. And in this kind of arrangement, the line between leverage and liability was thinner than she could afford to misjudge. The word temporary did not leave the room. It stayed, lingering in Ava's mind long after it was spoken, because she understood what it really meant. Not time, not duration, but condition, and conditions could shift without warning, without explanation, and that meant everything she had just gained could disappear just as quickly as it came. And for a moment, that thought pressed against something inside her, something she had not fully shut down yet, the part of her that still wanted certainty, still wanted something stable to hold on to. And it surfaced quietly, almost without permission, a question she had not asked out loud, not to him, but to herself. What if this was the moment she could trust someone, even just enough to make this easier, even just enough to stop carrying everything alone? And the thought was dangerous, not because it was weak, but because it felt reasonable, and Ava recognized that immediately, because nothing in this place was built on reason that served her. It was built on control, on leverage, on shifting interests that could turn without warning, and she felt the weight of that understanding pull her back, steadying her, reminding her of everything that had led her here, the night she was left outside, the silence that followed, the way the world had watched her fall without stepping in, the way every step since had been guided by forces she could not see. And that was when the conflict inside her sharpened, not into confusion, but into choice. Because she understood what this moment was asking of her, not out loud, not directly, but clearly. She could lean into this arrangement, allow herself to believe that alignment meant safety, that access meant support, that this man standing in front of her was something more than a function within a system, or she could accept the harder truth, that nothing here was given without a cost, and that cost would always come due when she was least prepared for it. And Ava felt that tension build, quiet but intense, because both paths carried risk, both required something from her. One demanded trust, the other demanded distance, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel it fully, not pushing it away, not denying it, the exhaustion of carrying everything alone, the weight of constant calculation, the absence of anything that felt real or certain. And it would have been easy, so easy, to let that pull her towards something softer, something that felt like connection, even if it was only an illusion. And she saw it clearly now, how people broke inside systems like this, not because they were weak, but because they reached for something human in a place that did not operate on humanity. And that realization settled into her deeper than anything before, because it was not about him. Not really. It was about her, about what she chose to become in order to survive this. And Ava stood there, completely still, her hand resting lightly against her stomach, grounding herself in something that was still hers, something that had not been shaped by this system, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the conflict inside her resolved, not into comfort, but into clarity, because she understood now that there was no safe version of this path, no version where she could rely on someone else without risking everything she had already fought to hold on to. And that meant her choice was not between trust and isolation, it was between control and vulnerability, and Ava knew which one would keep her alive inside this structure. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried that decision, quiet, steady, unshaken. "Then we understand each other," she said. Not as agreement, not as connection, but as acknowledgement of the terms that now defined everything between them. And in that moment, Ava felt the last piece of hesitation fall away, because she was no longer balancing between who she had been and who she needed to become. She had chosen, completely, and there was no going back, because from this point forward, every move she made would be calculated, controlled, and entirely her own, no matter what it cost her. The decision settled into Ava not as a moment, but as a structure, something that reshaped the way she saw everything around her, because now every detail mattered, every pause, every glance, every piece of information she had touched or been allowed to see. And instead of reacting to what was in front of her, she began to map what was missing, what had not been said, what had been deliberately kept just out of reach. And that was where her plan began, not with action, but with absence, because she understood now that the most valuable leverage in this system was not what you revealed, but what you let others assume. And Ava stood still, her expression unchanged, her breathing calm. But her mind moved faster than it ever had before, connecting fragments, reconstructing patterns, building something layered, something that could not be seen all at once. And she started with the first layer, information, because she already knew the system tracked movement, behavior, anomalies, which meant if she moved too directly, too clearly, she would be corrected, contained again. So instead she chose subtlety. She would not ask for more access. She would use what she had already been given, and more importantly, she would let them believe she was still learning, still adjusting, still within acceptable limits. And that illusion became her first shield, her first piece of control. And then came the second layer. People, not allies, not partners, but points of pressure, because she had seen enough to understand that no one here operated alone. Every action was part of a chain, and chains could be traced, could be influenced if you knew where to apply just enough force without breaking them. And Ava began to identify those points, the subtle reactions, the delayed responses, the moments where attention shifted just slightly off rhythm, and she stored them, not acting yet, just marking them, because timing would matter more than intention. And then came the third layer, situation, the environment itself, because she understood now that this system relied on predictability, on controlled variables. And the moment something fell outside that control, it triggered response, and response created opportunity. And Ava realized she did not need to fight the system directly. She needed to create a moment where it had to react in a way it could not fully manage. And that was where everything would converge, information, people, and situation aligning into something that looked accidental from the outside, but was anything but. And as this structure formed in her mind, Ava did not show it, not even a hint. She remained still, composed, exactly as they expected her to be now, because the most important part of her plan was invisibility. Not the kind she had suffered before, but a chosen one, controlled, intentional. And she allowed the silence to settle around her again, not as pressure, but as cover. And for the first time since she stepped into this place, she was no longer reacting to the system. She was preparing to move within it in a way it would not anticipate. And that was the difference, because everything she had done before had been observed, processed, accounted for. But this was something else, something layered enough to exist beneath their immediate awareness. And as her eyes lifted slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to take in the room one more time, Ava felt the plan locking into place, piece by piece, each layer reinforcing the next, each step dependent on timing, precision, and control, and she knew it would not be immediate, it would not be simple, but it would work if she held it together long enough. And that was when the tension returned. Not from the room, not from the people around her, but from within the plan itself, because once it began, it would not stop. It would move forward whether she was ready or not. And as she stood there, outwardly calm, inwardly calculating, Ava understood the truth of what she had just set in motion, because this was no longer about survival. This was about control, and somewhere beneath the surface of everything that looked still, everything that felt contained, the first pieces of her plan were already beginning to shift into place, quietly, precisely, like a countdown no one else could hear yet. The plan had already begun to move beneath the surface, subtle, controlled, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. And Ava held herself perfectly still, allowing the system to continue as it always had, because that was the key. Nothing could feel different too soon. Nothing could shift too obviously. And for a moment, everything aligned exactly the way she expected. The silence, the spacing, the rhythm of attention. Even the way the man in front of her adjusted his stance, all of it fell into the pattern she had mapped, and Ava felt it. That quiet confirmation that her structure was holding, that the layers were working together the way she intended. And then it changed, not dramatically, not with noise or interruption, but with something far more dangerous, a delay, just a fraction longer than it should have been, a pause in the system that did not follow the pattern she had studied. And Ava noticed it instantly, because she had trained herself to, and in that small deviation, something inside her tightened, not panic, not yet, but awareness, sharp and immediate, because delays here did not happen without reason, and her mind moved quickly, recalculating, adjusting, searching for the cause. And that was when she saw it. Not directly, not clearly, but enough. One of the men behind had shifted position again, but this time it was not reactive, it was preemptive, like he was responding to something she could not see, something outside the immediate space. And Ava felt the first crack in her plan form, small, but real, because this was not part of the sequence she had built. This was something external, something unaccounted for, and she did not react outwardly. She could not afford to. Instead, she held her posture, her expression unchanged, while internally everything accelerated, every layer of her plan adjusting at once. Because now the timing was off, and timing was everything. And then the second shift came, faster this time. The man in front of her did not speak, but his attention broke, just for a second, not toward her, but toward something beyond her, something behind the structure she could not see. And Ava felt it immediately. The center of control moving away from her, even if only briefly. And that was the moment she understood. This was not just a deviation. This was interference. And interference meant her plan was no longer operating in isolation. Something else had entered the system. Something with enough influence to disrupt the flow she had carefully mapped. And her breath slowed, not out of calm, but out of control, forcing herself to remain steady while everything inside her recalibrated. Because she had anticipated resistance, she had prepared for reaction, but she had not prepared for this, for something outside her frame of reference altering the structure itself, and the realization settled in fast, cold, precise. She was not the only one moving within this system anymore, and that changed everything, because it meant her assumptions, her timing, even her leverage could be compromised without warning. And Ava's mind moved through possibilities, quickly, methodically, trying to identify the source. But there was not enough information, not yet, and that was the most dangerous part, because she could not see what she was up against, and in a system built on visibility and control, that kind of blind spot was a liability she could not afford. And still, she held her position, because breaking now would confirm everything, would expose the layers she had built before they had a chance to fully align. And so she stayed still, even as the tension around her shifted into something unfamiliar, something less predictable. And for the first time since she had taken control of her approach, Ava felt the edge of uncertainty return, not overwhelming, not paralyzing, but present, because the system she thought she was beginning to understand had just revealed something else, something deeper, something that operated beyond the patterns she had learned. And as the silence stretched again, no longer controlled in the same way, Ava understood the truth of the moment with absolute clarity. This was no longer her plan alone, and whatever had just entered the equation was already pushing it in a direction she had not anticipated. The disruption did not fade. It lingered in the air like something unfinished, something unresolved, and Ava felt it immediately, not as fear, but as data, because whatever had interfered with her plan had revealed something more valuable than control. It had revealed weakness, not hers, but the system's, and that realization came fast, sharp, undeniable, because for the first time since she stepped into this place, the structure had not behaved perfectly. It had hesitated, and hesitation in a system built on precision was not an accident. It was a signal, and Ava locked onto it instantly, because this was the moment where most people would try to regain what they lost, would push harder, move faster, react to the disruption. But she did the opposite. She slowed down, deliberately, forcing her mind to step back from the immediate shift and look at the pattern behind it. Because whatever had entered the system was not random. It had influence, and influence left traces, even if they were small, and Ava began to trace them, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, mapping the delay, the shift in attention, the change in posture, and one detail stood out above the rest. The break in control had not come from the man in front of her. It had come from somewhere beyond him, something that affected him without requiring his acknowledgement, and that changed everything, because it meant there was a higher layer still active, still watching, still adjusting in real time. And instead of resisting that realization, Ava leaned into it. Because if something above him could shift the system, then that was where the real leverage existed, and her plan adjusted instantly, not collapsing, but evolving, because she no longer needed to control this level. She needed to reach beyond it. And that required a different kind of move, not direct, not visible, but indirect, something that would ripple upward instead of outward. And Ava understood how to do that, because she had already seen the structure of communication, the way information moved without words, the way reactions triggered chains of response, and she used that, subtly, precisely, shifting her posture just enough to signal disengagement, not withdrawal, but recalibration. And that alone created a ripple, because disengagement in a system like this was not ignored, it was evaluated, and Ava felt it happen almost immediately. The attention that had drifted away returned, not fully, not openly, but enough, and that was all she needed, because now she controlled the point of focus again, even if only slightly, and she spoke, not to push, not to demand, but to introduce something new into the system, something that did not belong to the current layer. If I was only part of a lower structure, she said calmly, her voice steady, then the interference we just felt would not exist. And the statement landed exactly where she intended, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as an observation that pointed upward, beyond the visible interaction, and Ava saw it immediately. The reaction she had been looking for, subtle, controlled, but real, because this time the man did not respond right away, and more importantly, neither did the others, and that silence was different, heavier, because it was not contained within the room anymore. It extended beyond it, and Ava understood what that meant. She had reached something higher, something that required consideration beyond the immediate structure, and she held that moment carefully, not pushing it, not breaking it, because this was not about forcing a result, it was about confirming access. And as the seconds passed, Ava felt the shift settle into something stable, something she could use, because now she knew, with certainty, that her position was not limited to the level she had been interacting with. She was connected to something larger, something that had already begun to respond to her presence. And that was the advantage she had been missing, not control over the system, but visibility within it. And visibility at that level was power, real power, because it meant she was no longer just being processed, she was being monitored with intent, and that changed the balance in a way nothing else had. And as the man finally spoke again, slower, more measured than before, Ava did not focus on his words, she focused on the shift behind them, because she had already gained what she needed, a confirmed connection to a higher layer of the system, and that was something no one had intended to give her, something she had forced into existence through adaptation, not resistance. And as she stood there, completely still, her expression unchanged, Ava felt it settle into her, That new position, fragile but real, because from this point forward, she was no longer operating within a single level of control, she was influencing multiple layers at once. And that was not just an advantage, it was a foundation, the first real piece of leverage that could not be easily taken away. And for the first time since everything began, Ava understood that the balance was no longer fixed. It was shifting, and she was the one starting to move it. The shift did not need to be announced. It revealed itself in the smallest fracture of control, and Ava felt at the moment the room hesitated again. But this time it was different, not disruption, not interference, but alignment. Because she was no longer reacting to what the system did, she was directing where it had to respond. And that realization settled into her with a quiet certainty that changed everything. Because for the first time, she was not waiting for permission, she was creating necessity, and she moved carefully, deliberately, choosing her next step with precision, not to push the system, but to force it into a position where it had no choice but to follow her lead. And she began with what she had already confirmed, the higher layer, the unseen level that had already reacted once, and she targeted it again, but this time with intent, her voice steady, controlled, carrying no urgency. "You are not the final decision point," she said, not to challenge the man in front of her, but to acknowledge the structure above him. And the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, because this time the silence that followed was not contained in the room at all. It stretched beyond it, deeper, heavier, and Ava held that moment, not breaking it, not rushing it, because she understood that this was where power moved, not in words, but in recognition. And then she added the second piece, the one that would lock it in place. "So if I am already being evaluated beyond this level," she continued calmly, "then restricting access here does not limit me. It only delays the outcome you are already tracking." And that was the move, precise, layered, because she had just reframed her position completely, not as a subject within the system, but as an active variable already under higher observation, and Ava saw it, not in expression, but in reaction, the change she had been waiting for, the shift in posture, the subtle tightening of attention, the moment where control did not just adjust, it transferred, because now the decision was no longer contained at this level, it had been escalated, and she had forced it there, and that was when it happened. Not loudly, not visibly, but clearly, the man in front of her did not respond. Not immediately, and that pause was everything, because it confirmed what she needed. He was no longer the one deciding. He was waiting, and Ava felt it settle into her. That shift in hierarchy, that transfer of control, because she had just moved the interaction beyond him, beyond the layer she had been confined to, and that was power, real power. Because it meant she was no longer negotiating within the system, she was influencing how the system itself responded. And Ava did not stop there, because she knew the moment had to be completed, sealed, before it could be reversed. And so she made her final move, small, controlled, but irreversible. "Then I will proceed as if that access is already granted," she said quietly, not asking, not waiting, just stating it as an outcome already in motion. And the silence that followed was no longer neutral, it was reactive, because now the system had a choice, correct her and confirm restriction, or allow it and confirm escalation. And Ava held that tension perfectly, not pushing, not retreating, just existing within it, forcing the system to resolve itself around her. And then it happened, the response she had been building toward, subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable. The man stepped slightly aside. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to signal that the path in front of her was no longer blocked, and Ava felt it. Immediately, that shift from containment to allowance, from restriction to controlled access, and she moved forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the same calm precision she had maintained from the beginning, because this was not victory, not yet, it was positioning, and as she passed him, she felt it, the change in the room, the attention no longer watching her as an anomaly, but tracking her as a factor, something that could not be ignored, something that had to be accounted for differently. And that was when she understood the full weight of what she had just done. She had not broken the system. She had not escaped it. She had redefined her place within it. And that was far more dangerous, because now every movement she made would carry influence, and every decision would ripple outward. And as she stepped further into the space ahead, Ava did not need to look back to know what had changed. She could feel it in the way the air held still, in the way no one moved. Without intention, in the way the silence itself seemed to acknowledge her presence differently, because the system had recognized her, not as something to contain, but as something to watch carefully, and that recognition carried something new, something undeniable, because for the first time, it was not just curiosity or control that followed her, it was caution. The space behind her did not stay silent for long, and Ava felt it before she heard it, that subtle shift in tension, the kind that only appeared when control began to slip, not completely, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by someone who knew where to look, and she did not turn immediately. She did not react, because she understood now that the most powerful position was not to respond to movement, but to let it reveal itself, and so she kept walking, slow, measured, each step deliberate, allowing the system to adjust around her instead of chasing it. And that was when it came, his voice, not louder, not sharp, but different, carrying something that had not been there before. "You are moving too far ahead," he said, and Ava stopped, not because he told her to, but because the tone itself had changed, and that was what mattered, because for the first time, it was not purely controlled. It carried something else, something closer to urgency, and Ava felt it immediately, not as pressure, but as confirmation, because urgency meant loss of control, even if only partially, and she turned slowly, not rushed, not defensive, just enough to face him again, and what she saw was not obvious, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The stillness he had maintained before was no longer perfect. There was a fracture in it, small, but real, in the way his posture held tension instead of neutrality, in the way his gaze did not just observe her, but followed her, more closely than before, and Ava understood in that moment that the balance had shifted, not completely, not safely, but enough to be felt, and she held that awareness carefully, because this was not a moment to push blindly. It was a moment to measure exactly how far the shift had gone, and she spoke, her voice calm, unchanged. "Then adjust," she said simply, not as defiance, not as challenge, but as a statement of fact, and the words landed differently than anything before, because they did not ask for permission, they assumed response, and Ava saw it. The reaction, immediate but controlled, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his breathing changed just enough to break the rhythm he had held from the beginning. And that was new. That was something she had not seen before, and it confirmed what she needed to know. He was no longer operating from a place of complete detachment. He was reacting, even if only slightly. And Ava felt the weight of that realization settle into her, because it meant her presence was no longer just being processed, it was influencing, and influence created instability, and instability was where power could be shifted, and she stepped forward again, not toward him, but into the space that had opened, claiming it without hesitation, because hesitation now would give him back what he had just lost. And as she moved, she kept her eyes on him, not to challenge, but to observe, to track the changes, and they were there, subtle, but undeniable, because now he did not look at her as something contained within a system. He looked at her as something that required direct response, something that could not be left to process on its own, and that alone changed the entire dynamic between them, and Ava felt it, not as dominance, not as victory, but as leverage, real leverage. Because for the first time, he was no longer fully in control of how this interaction unfolded, and that meant she could shape it, even if only in small ways, and she chose her next move carefully, because this was where mistakes would cost everything, and instead of pushing further, she slowed again, deliberately, creating space, forcing him to either fill it or allow her to define it. And when she spoke, her voice was softer now, but sharper in intention. "You said this was about managing. What comes next?" she said, her gaze steady. "But now you are trying to slow it down." And that statement did not accuse, it revealed, and Ava saw it immediately. The way it landed, the way it forced him into a position he had not planned for, because now his reaction was visible, measurable, and for the first time, he did not answer right away, and that silence, that delay, was everything, because it confirmed what she had already felt. The system was no longer moving smoothly around him. It was adjusting through him, and that difference was critical, because it meant he was no longer the source of control. He was part of its reaction, and Ava held that realization tightly. Because it was fragile, it could disappear if she misread it, but it was real, and she could use it, and for a moment, the space between them held that tension, thick, unresolved, until finally he spoke again, but this time, there was no mistaking it. The control was still there, but it was no longer absolute. "You are forcing outcomes you do not fully understand," he said, and beneath the calm, there was something else, something that had not been there before, not fear, not yet, but concern, real and undeniable, and Ava saw it clearly, because for the first time, he was not just managing the system, he was reacting to her within it, and that meant one thing above all else: he was no longer entirely in control. The words he had just spoken did not settle the tension. They exposed it, and Ava felt that exposure like a fracture finally opening all the way through, because for the first time, there was no more illusion left to hold on to, no more pieces missing that could be explained away, and the silence between them was no longer about control, it was about inevitability, and Ava stood there, completely still, as everything she had seen, everything she had felt, everything she had been forced to endure, began to align into something clear, something undeniable, and she did not rush to speak, because this moment was not about reaction, it was about recognition, and when it came all at once, not as a single answer, but as a complete picture. Daniel was never meant to keep anything, because he was placed there to remove her, not just from her home, but from her position, her access, her identity. The video was not an accident because it ensured she became visible in the worst possible way, labeled, dismissed, stripped of credibility before she even understood what was happening. The calls that went unanswered were not coincidence because they had already been filtered, redirected, cut off before they could reach anyone who might intervene. The system had not ignored her. It had isolated her, deliberately, precisely, step by step, until she was exactly where they needed her to be, vulnerable, exposed, disconnected from everything that once gave her leverage, and Ava felt it hit her, not as confusion, not as shock, but as something deeper, something that had been building from the moment she was pushed out into the cold, something that now finally had direction, because this was never about losing her home. It was about removing her from the structure she belonged to, because she was not just anyone. She was connected to something that mattered, something that had value beyond what she had been allowed to see. And that was why she had to be erased first, why her fall had to look natural, why her struggle had to look like failure instead of design. And Ava's breath slowed, not because she was calming down, but because she was holding something steady inside her, something that refused to break under the weight of that truth. And when she finally spoke, her voice was different, not softer, not louder, but clearer than it had ever been. "You did not just let it happen," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "You needed it to happen." And that was the line, the moment where everything shifted from understanding to acknowledgement. Because now the truth was no longer hidden behind structure or silence. It was spoken, placed directly between them. And Ava felt it, the impact of it, not just in him, but in herself, because saying it made it real in a way nothing else had. And suddenly the pain, the humiliation, the isolation, all of it rearranged itself into something else, something sharper, something justified. And for the first time, the anger she had been holding did not feel chaotic. It felt focused, directed, earned. Because she had not been weak. She had not been abandoned by chance. She had been removed, intentionally, by a system that decided she was either a risk or an asset that needed to be controlled. And that realization did not break her. It freed her, because now there was nothing left to question, nothing left to doubt. And Ava felt it rise inside her, not explosively, but steadily, like something that had been waiting for this exact moment to take shape. And she took a step forward, not aggressive, not reckless, but deliberate, grounded, her hand resting against her stomach, as if anchoring everything she was about to become, and her voice carried that certainty, that clarity, that complete absence of hesitation. "You needed me out of the system," she continued, "because I was already part of something you could not fully control." And the silence that followed did not deny her. It did not correct her. It confirmed her, because there was no longer any need to hide it. Not now. Not after everything had aligned so clearly, and Ava felt the final piece fall into place. Because this was not just about what had been done to her. It was about what she represented, something valuable enough to remove, something important enough to isolate, something dangerous enough that they could not risk her staying where she was. And that changed everything, because now she understood her position completely, not as a victim, not as someone who needed to be saved, but as someone who had been targeted for a reason, and that reason still existed, still mattered, and could still be used. And Ava held that truth tightly, because it was no longer just information, it was justification for everything she was about to do, for every step she would take moving forward. Because this was not revenge, not in the way people would describe it. This was correction. This was balance. This was taking back what had been deliberately stripped from her. And as she stood there, steady, unshaken, looking directly at the man who had once held control over this entire space, Ava understood something with absolute certainty. There was no version of this where she would step back, no version where she would accept what had been done to her, because the truth had made one thing clear above all else. What she was about to do was not just justified. It was necessary, and there was no longer any path forward that did not lead through it. The truth did not slow anything down. It accelerated it, and Ava felt that shift immediately, not in the room itself, but in the way every piece of the system around her began to tighten, like something long contained was now moving toward a point it could no longer avoid. And she stood there for a brief second, letting it settle, letting the weight of what she had uncovered align with what she already knew was coming next. Because this was no longer about understanding, this was about execution, and there was no space left for hesitation, no room for doubt, because everything had already been set in motion long before she realized it. And now it was converging, all of it, the structure, the layers, the people, the decisions that had been made in silence, all of it pulling toward a single point where it would have to resolve. And Ava understood exactly where that point was, because she had already positioned herself at the center of it, not by chance, not by reaction, but by design. And that realization grounded her completely, because for the first time, she was not walking into something unknown. She was stepping into something she had already prepared for, and she turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the space ahead, where the next layer of the system waited, and she could feel it, the attention gathering, not just from him, not just from the men behind him, but from something larger, something that had been observing from the beginning and was now fully engaged. And that was what mattered, because this was no longer contained to a single interaction. It had expanded, escalated, and there was no pulling it back now. And Ava moved forward again, her steps measured, deliberate, every movement carrying intent, because she knew now that every action she took would be seen, evaluated, responded to. And that was exactly what she wanted, because visibility at this level was not a risk anymore. It was leverage. And as she moved deeper into the space, the environment itself began to shift, not physically, but in presence. The silence was no longer passive. It was active, watching, calculating, waiting, and Ava felt the pressure of it, not as something to resist, but as something to use, because pressure forced decisions, and decisions revealed priorities. And that was what she needed, not just from him, but from whatever existed above him. And she slowed just slightly, enough to create a moment, enough to force the system to respond to her position rather than anticipate it. And in that moment, everything aligned again, the timing, the structure, the attention, all of it focusing toward her in a way that could not be reversed. And she spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that cut through everything around her. "You have been preparing for this longer than I have," she said, her voice steady. "But now we are in the same place." And the words did not challenge, they established, because this was no longer about uncovering the truth. It was about acknowledging that both sides had reached the same point, and that point demanded resolution, and Ava felt it. The shift that followed, not hesitation, not delay, but convergence, because now there were no more layers to hide behind, no more steps to take before the outcome had to begin forming. And she stood there, completely still, her hand resting against her stomach, grounding her in the one thing that had carried her through all of this. And for a moment, everything slowed, not because time changed, but because the weight of what was about to happen settled into place, and Ava allowed herself to feel it. Not fear, not doubt, but certainty, because there was no longer a question of whether this would happen, only how it would unfold. And that was when she understood the final piece. This was not just her confrontation. It was theirs. Every decision they had made, every step they had taken to remove her, to isolate her, had led them here as well. And now they were just as committed to this outcome as she was. And that was what made it irreversible. And as the silence tightened one last time, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain, Ava felt it clearly. The countdown had already begun, and there was no stopping what came next. The moment did not explode. It tightened, like a wire pulled just to the edge of breaking, and Ava stood exactly where she needed to be, not at the center of the room, but at the center of the tension itself, where every word would matter more than any action, and she felt it immediately. The shift in attention not just from the man in front of her, but from everything beyond him, watching, calculating, waiting to see who would move first. And Ava did not rush. She did not speak. She let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until it forced a response, because now she understood that whoever broke that silence first would reveal their position. And when he finally did, his voice carried control, but it no longer carried certainty. "You are assuming control that has not been given," he said, and Ava heard it clearly, not as authority, but as resistance, and that difference mattered, because resistance meant he was reacting, not leading, and she answered without hesitation, her voice calm, precise. "Control is not given here," she said, her gaze steady. "It is recognized." And the words landed with weight, because they did not argue, they reframed, and Ava saw it immediately. The way his posture adjusted, just slightly, the way his attention sharpened again, not outward, but inward, toward her, and that was the shift she needed. Because now this was no longer about the system alone. This was about the space between them, the line neither of them had fully crossed yet, and Ava stepped into it carefully, not physically, but through presence, holding his gaze without challenge, without retreat. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, and that silence felt different than before, not controlled by the structure around them, but by the tension they were now creating together. And Ava felt it settle into her, steady, grounded, because this was no longer unfamiliar territory. This was where she had been moving toward from the beginning, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but sharper. "You needed me removed because I was not predictable," she said, not asking, not accusing, just placing the truth where it could not be ignored. And the reaction came instantly, not in words, but in stillness, a pause that lasted just long enough to confirm everything. And Ava did not look away, because she knew now that looking away would give back what she had taken. And she continued, her tone unchanged. "And now I am the only variable you cannot account for." And that was the moment the tension peaked, not visibly, not loudly, but unmistakably, because for the first time, she had said it completely, not in fragments, not in implication, but in full clarity. And Ava felt the impact of it, not just in him, but in the space itself, because the system around them did not react the way it had before. It held, it waited, it did not correct her. And that was the most dangerous confirmation of all, because it meant she was no longer being processed in the same way. She was being considered, and Ava held that realization tightly, because it was fragile. It could shift again at any moment, and she knew that. She felt it in the tension that still surrounded them, in the way nothing had fully resolved yet. And that was what made this moment different, because this was not an end, not even close. This was the beginning of something far more complex, and she saw it in his response, slower now, more deliberate. "You believe that makes you untouchable," he said, and Ava almost smiled, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, because she understood what that meant. He was no longer dismissing her, he was defining her, and that meant he was adjusting to her position, not controlling it. And she answered just as calmly, just as precisely, "No," she said, her voice steady. "It makes me necessary." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, because now both of them understood exactly where they stood, not above, not below, but within a balance that had not existed before. And Ava felt it clearly. The shift that had brought them here was real, but it was not stable, not yet, because nothing had been decided, nothing had been resolved. And that was what made it dangerous, because every word from this point forward would shape what came next. And as she held his gaze, unbroken, unmoved. Ava understood one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the final confrontation. This was only the first move in a much larger game, and neither of them had shown everything they were capable of yet. The balance did not hold. It shattered, not with noise, not with movement, but with a single shift that could not be undone, and Ava felt it the second she made the decision to stop waiting, because she understood now that the longer she allowed this to remain a negotiation, the more space he had to recover, to recalibrate, to rebuild the control he was already starting to lose, and she would not give him that chance, not anymore. And so she stepped forward, not physically, but through intent, through presence, through a line she had not crossed until this exact moment. And when she spoke, her voice did not carry explanation, it carried finality. "You are not deciding anything anymore," she said, and the words landed differently than anything before, not because they were louder, not because they were sharper, but because they removed something completely, the illusion that this interaction was still balanced. And Ava saw it instantly, the reaction he could not fully contain, the way his posture shifted, not outward, but inward, the way his control tightened instead of expanding. And that was the fracture she had been waiting for, because control that tightens is already slipping, and she did not stop. She could not stop now, because this was the moment where everything had to change, completely, irreversibly, and she continued, her gaze unwavering, her tone steady. "You thought removing me would simplify the system," she said, each word placed with precision, but all it did was expose where the real control is, and that was the strike, not against him, but against the structure he had been holding on to, and Ava felt the impact of it ripple outward, not visibly, but undeniably, because the silence that followed was no longer neutral, it was reactive, it was processing something it had not accounted for, and that was when she made her final move. The one that broke everything open. "And now I am standing exactly where you cannot reach without admitting it," she said quietly. And in that moment, something shifted completely, not just in him, but in the entire space around them, because now the system was no longer holding its shape, it was adjusting around her, and Ava felt it, not as pressure, but as alignment, because this was no longer resistance. This was reconfiguration, and she held her position, not pushing further, not retreating, because she understood that dominance was not about force, it was about certainty, and she had that now, completely, and she saw it in him, clearly, for the first time, not in what he said, but in what he could not hide, the hesitation that lasted too long, the breath that broke rhythm, the moment where his response did not come immediately, and that was everything, because that was where control used to live, and now it was gone, replaced by something else. Something reactive, something uncertain, and Ava did not need to say anything else. She did not need to prove anything further, because the shift had already happened, completely, and as she stood there, still, grounded, unshaken, she felt it settle into place. That new reality, that new dynamic where she was no longer the one being evaluated, she was the one forcing evaluation, and that was the difference that could not be undone, and the silence that followed was heavy, absolute, filled with everything that had just changed, but no one spoke, not him, not anyone beyond him, because for the first time, there was nothing left to say that could restore what had just been lost, and the weight of that realization held the entire space still, suspended in a moment where everything had already shifted, but no one had yet found the words to acknowledge it. It did not collapse all at once, it unraveled, piece by piece, like a structure that had been held together by pressure instead of truth, and Ava stood at the center of it, not pushing, not forcing, just watching as the cracks she had exposed began to spread on their own, because that was the nature of a system built on control. Once its foundation was questioned, everything above it had to respond, and not everything could hold, and she saw it first in the smallest reactions, the subtle shifts in attention from the men behind him, the way they no longer stood in perfect alignment, the way their focus flickered, not just toward her, but toward each other, as if recalculating positions they had never questioned before, and that was where it began, not with resistance, but with doubt, and doubt was far more dangerous than any direct challenge, because it did not need to be confronted, it only needed to exist, and Ava let it grow, because she understood now that she did not need to dismantle anything herself. She only needed to allow the truth to remain visible, and the system would do the rest, and it did, faster than anyone expected. Because once one layer began to hesitate, the layers above it had to adjust, and those adjustments created gaps, small at first, almost invisible, but enough for everything to start slipping out of place, and Ava felt it as it happened. The loss of synchronization, the subtle delays, the moments where responses came just a second too late, just slightly off from what they should have been, and those moments stacked, one after another, until the structure that once felt seamless now felt unstable, and she watched him as it unfolded, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with clarity, because this was not about him alone. It was about everything connected to him, everything that had relied on the illusion that control was absolute. And that illusion was gone now, completely, and she saw it in the way his authority no longer carried the same weight, in the way the silence around him was no longer obedient, but questioning. And that was when the shift accelerated. Because once the system stopped responding as a single unit, it began responding as separate parts, and separate parts did not hold power the same way. They competed, they hesitated, they revealed, and Ava felt the ripple move outward, beyond the immediate space, into the layers she could not see but could now sense clearly, because the attention that had once been focused, controlled, was now divided, pulled in different directions by the very instability she had introduced, and that division was everything, because it meant no one was fully in control anymore, not him, not the layer above him, not even the system itself, and Ava did not move. She did not interrupt, she let it happen, because this was the outcome she had been building toward from the beginning, not destruction, but exposure, and exposure forced collapse, not through force, but through truth, and she saw it reach its tipping point in a moment so small it could have been missed. One of the men behind shifted again, but this time it was not to adjust, it was to step back, just slightly, just enough to create space between himself and the structure he had been part of, and that single movement carried more weight than anything else, because it signaled the first break in alignment, the first visible sign that the system was no longer holding together, and once that happened, it spread, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, as more of them began to hesitate, to question, to reposition themselves in ways they never would have before, and Ava felt it settle into place, that irreversible shift, because this was no longer a confrontation. This was a collapse in progress, and she had not forced it, she had revealed it, and that was why it could not be stopped. And as she stood there, completely still, her presence no longer contested, no longer contained, Ava understood exactly what this meant, not just for this moment, but for everything that would follow, because once a system lost its ability to hold itself together, it could not return to what it was, it could only fall apart or be rebuilt, and she had already decided which direction this would go. And as the silence around her deepened, no longer controlled, no longer stable, Ava knew with absolute certainty, there was only one step left before everything would be finished. The movement had stopped, but nothing felt still, because beneath the surface everything was already shifting toward its final state, and Ava stood at the center of it, not as someone caught inside the collapse, but as the one who had outlasted it, who had moved through every layer of it without breaking, and now there was nothing left in front of her that could truly oppose her, only remnants, fragments of a system that no longer held its own shape, and she felt that clearly, not as victory, but as control, complete and undeniable, because for the first time since this began, there was no force pushing against her, no hidden layer adjusting her position, no unseen hand redirecting her path. Everything had aligned, every variable, every reaction, every consequence, all of it now sitting within her reach. And Ava allowed herself to take that in, not emotionally, not impulsively, but with precision, because this moment required clarity more than anything else, and she looked forward, not at any one person, not at any single point, but at the entirety of what remained, and it felt different now, smaller, quieter, because without its control, the system had lost its weight, and that realization settled into her deeply, because it reminded her of where she started, of the cold night, the silence, the way everything had been taken from her without explanation, and for a brief second, that memory surfaced, not to weaken her, but to anchor her, to show her exactly how far she had come, from being pushed out, ignored, erased, to standing here, where nothing could move without her awareness, without her influence, and she did not rush past that. She let it exist, just long enough to feel the contrast, because that contrast was what gave this moment its meaning, and then it was gone, replaced by something else, something steadier, something sharper, because Ava was not the same person anymore, not the one who had been forced into silence, not the one who had been defined by what was done to her. She had moved beyond that, completely, and she felt it in the way her body held still without tension, in the way her breath remained even, in the way her thoughts no longer scattered but aligned. And that was the clearest sign of all. She was no longer reacting to the situation, she was defining it. And everything around her reflected that. The distance between her and the others, the hesitation in their movement, the absence of interruption, all of it pointing to the same truth. The control had shifted fully, and it was not going back, and Ava understood what that meant, not just for this moment, but for what came next, because this was the point where everything had to be decided, not by them, not by the system, but by her. And that realization carried weight, real weight, because with control came consequence, and whatever she chose now would not just end this, it would shape everything that followed, and she did not take that lightly, not after everything she had seen, everything she had learned, because this was no longer about proving anything, it was about defining what remained, and Ava stood there, grounded, present, completely aware of every detail around her, every shift, every breath, every second that passed, and for a moment, she did nothing, not because she hesitated, but because she understood that this was the last moment before everything changed permanently, and she allowed it to stretch, just enough to feel its weight, just enough to confirm that there was no doubt left, no uncertainty, no fear, and when she finally moved, it was not sudden, it was not dramatic, it was precise, controlled, inevitable, because the decision had already been made, long before this moment arrived, and now she was simply stepping into it, fully, completely, without hesitation, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to wait for, and as she looked forward, her gaze steady, unshaken, Ava chose. The decision did not arrive as a burst of emotion. It arrived as structure, clean, deliberate, fully formed, and Ava stepped into it without hesitation, because everything she had endured, everything she had learned, had led her to this exact moment where action was no longer a reaction. It was a standard, and she held that standard firmly as she moved, not toward confrontation, but toward resolution, and when she spoke, her voice carried something new, not tension, not defiance, but authority. This does not end with removal, she said, her gaze steady. It ends with accountability. And the words did not echo, they settled, because they were not meant to provoke, they were meant to define what came next, and Ava saw the effect immediately, not in resistance, but in stillness, because the system that once operated on control now had to respond to something else, something it was not designed for, transparency. And she used that, precisely, because she knew that what had protected them before was not power alone. It was obscurity, the ability to act without being fully seen, and she removed that completely, layer by layer, with clarity instead of force. Every step that led here is recorded, she continued, her tone even. Every decision, every filter, every redirection, none of it disappears just because the structure failed. And that was the shift, because now this was no longer about who controlled the space. It was about what could be proven within it. And Ava felt the impact ripple outward instantly, because this kind of exposure did not require confrontation. It required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement forced consequence, and she did not rush the moment. She let it settle, because this was not about overwhelming them. It was about making sure there was no path left to deny what had happened, and she stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, but opening the space, allowing the weight of her words to expand beyond her, to reach every layer that had been listening. And that was when the real shift began, not in him, not directly, but in everything connected to him, because once the system understood that what had been hidden was now visible, it could no longer operate the same way, and Ava saw it. The hesitation deepen, the alignment break further, the quiet recognition that what had been done could not be undone simply by regaining control, because control no longer erased consequence. And that was the difference she had created, and she held it firmly, because this was not about dismantling individuals. It was about redefining the rules they had relied on, and she made that clear, not with force, but with precision. "I am not here to replace what you built," she said calmly. "I am here to make sure it cannot function the way it did before." And that line settled into the space with finality, because it removed the idea of simple reversal, of restoring what had been lost, and replaced it with something far more permanent, change. And Ava felt the weight of that settle into her as well, because she understood what she was doing. She was not destroying the system. She was forcing it to evolve, to operate under conditions it could not ignore. And that required control, real control, not over people, but over outcome. And she maintained that control carefully, never raising her voice, never stepping beyond what was necessary, because this was not about dominance. It was about standard, and she would not lower that standard, not now, not after. Everything. And as the silence stretched again, no longer uncertain, but heavy with realization, Ava knew the shift was complete, not because they had accepted it, but because they could no longer reject it. And that was enough, because from this point forward, every action they took would carry consequence they could not erase, and she had ensured that, completely. And as she stood there, steady, composed, her presence no longer questioned, Ava felt the first signs of it, not in the room, but beyond it, the system beginning to respond differently, not with control, but with correction. And that was when she understood the final truth of this moment. Justice was not something she had taken, it was something she had forced into existence, and now it would move on its own. And as the weight of that settled in, Ava did not feel relief, she felt clarity, because she knew this was only the beginning of what would follow. And already, the consequences were starting to unfold in ways no one could stop. The noise of control had faded, not abruptly, but gradually, like something losing its hold without resistance. And Ava stood within that quiet, not as someone who had conquered, but as someone who had endured long enough to see the truth settle into place. And for the first time since everything began, there was no pressure pushing against her, no tension pulling her forward, only a stillness that felt earned, steady, and complete. And she allowed herself to feel it, not as relief, but as clarity, because what remained now was not the chaos of before, but the result of it, shaped, defined, and no longer uncertain. And the people around her reflected that shift in ways they could not fully hide. The distance they kept was no longer about control. It was about recognition, the way their eyes moved, the way their posture held, all of it carrying a quiet understanding that the dynamic had changed permanently. And Ava did not need to reinforce it. She did not need to claim it, because it was already there, embedded in every interaction, in every moment of silence that no longer questioned her presence. And she turned slightly, not to leave, but to observe, to take in what this new state looked like, because it mattered, not just for what had ended, but for what would continue. And she saw it clearly. The structure was still there, but it was different now, stripped of the certainty it once carried, operating under something new, something it had not accounted for before. And that was enough, because it meant the change was not temporary, it was structural. And Ava felt that settle into her as well, not as pride, not as victory, but as understanding. Because this was what she had been moving toward, not control over others, but control over herself within a system that no longer defined her. And that difference was everything. And she took a slow breath, steady, even, feeling the weight of the journey behind her without letting it pull her back, because she was not there anymore, not the woman in the cold, not the one who had been silenced, not the one who had been forced into a position she did not choose. She had moved through that, completely, and what remained now was something else, something stronger, quieter, more deliberate, and she could feel it in the way she stood, in the way her thoughts no longer rushed, in the way her presence no longer depended on how others saw her. And that was the clearest sign of all. She had changed, fully, and as she looked ahead, not searching, not questioning, but simply seeing, Ava understood what this moment meant, not as an ending, but as a point of balance, where everything that had been unstable was now settled, where everything that had been hidden was now visible, and where she no longer needed to fight for space within it, because that space was already hers, and she let that realization stay with her, not clinging to it, not pushing it away, just allowing it to exist as truth. And for a moment, everything felt quiet in a way it had not before, not empty, not uncertain, but calm, grounded, complete, and Ava remained there, steady, composed, her hand resting lightly where it had so many times before, not out of fear, not out of need, but out of connection, because through everything that had been her constant, her reason, her anchor, and now it no longer felt like something she had to protect from the world. It felt like something she could carry forward into it, without hesitation, without fear, and as the space around her settled fully. No longer shifting, no longer resisting, Ava allowed herself one final moment of stillness, not because she needed it, but because she had earned it. And in that quiet, with everything finally in its place, she simply stood, no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to become. And the calm that followed was not the absence of conflict, it was the presence of peace after it. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete, like something that had reached its natural end without needing to be forced, and Ava stood within it, not as someone who had simply survived what happened, but as someone who had transformed through it, completely, undeniably, and she could feel that difference in everything, in the way she carried herself, in the way her thoughts no longer circled around fear or doubt, in the way her presence no longer depended on permission or recognition from anyone else, because those things no longer held value the way they once did, and she understood now, with absolute clarity, that what had been taken from her was never just a place, or a relationship, or a position. It was her ability to define herself, and that was the one thing she had reclaimed fully, not through force, not through revenge, but through understanding, through control, through the quiet, deliberate choice to not break when everything around her expected her to. And as she looked ahead, she did not see obstacles the way she once had. She saw structure, patterns, systems that could be understood, navigated, even reshaped when necessary. And that was the true shift, because the world had not changed, but her place within it had, completely, and Ava allowed herself to take one slow breath, steady and calm, feeling the weight of everything behind her without letting it define what came next, because it no longer did, it no longer could, and she moved forward, not because she had something to prove, not because she needed to reclaim anything else, but because forward was simply where she belonged now, and the space around her reflected that in subtle ways, not through words, not through recognition, but through absence, the absence of resistance, the absence of dismissal, the absence of the quiet forces that once tried to confine her, and that absence spoke louder than anything else, because it meant one simple truth: she was no longer someone the system could ignore, or remove, or redefine without consequence. And that truth did not make her untouchable. It made her aware of her own position, her own value, her own ability to shape what came next, and that awareness was what mattered, because it was not something anyone could take from her again. And as she continued forward, her steps measured, her expression calm, Ava knew that what she carried now was not just the result of what had happened. It was something she had built, piece by piece, through every moment of doubt, every moment of pressure, every moment where she could have given up but did not. And that was what defined her now, not the injustice, not the fall, but the rise that followed it, the quiet, controlled, undeniable rise that no one had planned for. And that was the part they could never undo, because it did not exist within their system, it existed within her. And as the world around her continued to move, steady, unchanged on the surface, Ava felt no need to rush, no need to push, because she understood something now that she had not understood before. Power was not about control over others. It was about control over oneself within any situation. And once that was established, nothing else could truly take it away. And she carried that with her, not as something heavy, but as something natural, something that fit into every step she took, every decision she made, every moment she chose to stand instead of fall. And as she moved further away from everything that had once tried to define her, Ava did not look back, not because she was avoiding it, but because she no longer needed to, because what was behind her no longer held power over what was ahead. And that was the final truth, the one that settled quietly, deeply, leaving no room for doubt, no space for fear, only clarity. And as her path opened forward, steady and unshaken, Ava carried that truth with her, not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as something far more permanent, something that would shape everything that followed. Because in the end, it was never about what they took from her. It was about what she refused to become because of it. And that was something no one could ever control, no one could ever take, no one could ever erase. Because once you learn how to stand in your own power, the world does not decide who you are anymore. You do.